Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. I'd like to begin by welcoming members of the committee, witnesses, as well as those watching this meeting on the web. I'm Senator Yana Martin, and I'm the Senate's Joint Chair of this committee, and I'm joined by the Honorable Marc Garneau, the House of Commons Joint Chair. Today, we're continuing our examination of the statutory review of the provisions of the Criminal Code relating to the medical assistance in dying and their application. So the Board of Internal Economy requires that committees adhere to the health protocols which are in effect until June 23rd, 2022. And as joint chairs, we will enforce these measures, and we thank you for your cooperation. So I'd like to remind members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted unless recognized by name by the joint chair, and a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the joint chairs. And when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. Interpretation in this video conference will work like an in-person committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. So with that, I'd like to welcome on behalf of our committee our witnesses for panel 1 who are here to discuss whether to permit medical assistance in dying for mental illness in Canada. So first, in this panel, we have as individuals, Brian Mishara, Professor and Director, Center for Research and Intervention on Suicide, Ethical Issues and End-of-Life Practices, Université de Québec à Montréal, and Dr. Derek Smith, Clinical Professor Emeritus, Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia, and lastly, Mr. David E. Roberge, member, End of Life Working Group from the Canadian Bar Association. So thank you, witnesses, for joining us today. We'll begin opening remarks by Dr. Mishara, followed by Dr. Smith and Mr. Roberge. So Dr. Mishara, you have 5 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you. For 50 years, I've been conducting research on suicide prevention and end-of-life issues and working in suicide prevention. In 1995, I held the Boer-Alaskan National Fellowship in Human Rights Research to study euthanasia in the Netherlands. I published 12 books and over 180 scientific papers. We live in a country where our laws and culture emphasize respect for autonomous choice. However, society does impose limits to protect us from making decisions that are dangerous to ourselves. We are legally obliged to wear a helmet on a motorcycle, a seatbelt in a car, a hard hat in a construction site. Our government acts to protect competent people from making decisions that may endanger their health and well-being, whether they like it or not. We must protect people from making irreversible decisions to die when there is hope for recovery. I believe that suffering from a mental illness may be as intense as suffering from a physical illness. The key issue is whether it is possible to determine if suffering from a mental illness is interminable and irremediable. The expert panel report on MAID and mental illness states that there are no specific criteria for knowing that a mental illness is irremediable, and they do not provide one iota of evidence that anyone can reliably determine if an individual suffering from a mental illness will not improve. According to research, 50 to 60% of persons with depression or anxiety will recover without any treatment. Even the most severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia are unpredictable. 50% of people with schizophrenia meet objective criteria for recovery for significant periods during their lives. If it were possible to distinguish the very few people with a mental illness who are destined to suffer interminably from those whose suffering is treatable, it would be inhumane to deny MAID. But any attempt at identifying who should have access to MAID will make large numbers of mistakes and people who would have experienced improvements in their symptoms and no longer wish to die will die by MAID. Throughout the Western world, it has been statutory and customary practice to protect suicidal persons from dying. Almost all high-risk suicidal persons I have talked with would meet the current requirements for MAID. Over 90% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental disorder. They usually have many years of mental health treatments, and they are convinced that their suffering is intolerable, inevitable, and interminable. They are almost always wrong in their assessment. Even in extreme cases where a person is taken to hospital unwillingly, only 10% will attempt again, and only 1 to 3% will die. The vast majority are happy to have been saved and usually very thankful to be alive. For every heart-wrenching story of someone who suffered interminably from a mental illness, there are so many more people who got help and were happy to be alive. If MAID for people with a mental illness becomes legal next year, a large proportion of suicidal people could be dead instead of getting the help they need. Canada already has the most liberal access to MAID in the world. Elsewhere, all people who receive MAID are denied their request if there are other treatments available to alleviate physical and mental suffering. Both the physician and patient must agree that there is no reasonable alternative. In Canada, the physician must inform the patient of potential treatments, but if the patients don't feel they are acceptable, medical professionals are still obliged to end their lives. In the Netherlands, no one is forced to try the treatments, but the doctors are not allowed to end people's lives if they believe their suffering may be alleviated by other means. In the Netherlands, only 5% of requests for MAID for a mental disorder are granted. After receiving an average of 10 months of psychiatric evaluations, almost all requests are refused, usually because untried treatments are available. Even medical cases of terminal illness, in those cases, 40% of requests are refused because the doctor believes there is some untried treatment for the suffering, and hardly any of those refused repeat their request after trying the treatments. The expert panel's report ignored the research showing that a large proportion of people feeling utterly hopeless with a mental disorder will improve over time. They provide no evidence indicating that anyone can tell if a mental illness is incurable, irreversible, and enduring, because the research indicates this is currently not knowable. I have
Thank you, Dr. Mishara.
Known hundreds
Sorry.
of... Okay.
Yes, 5 minutes has passed.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I've personally known hundreds of thousands of people who have convincingly explained that they wanted to die to end their suffering and now thankful to be alive. If you proceed to allow MAID for persons with a mental illness, how many people who would later been happy to be alive are you willing to allow to die?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mishara. Next, we will have Dr. Smith for 5 minutes. Thank you. Dr. Smith? I'm not sure if Dr. Smith is with us. Okay,
There.
so yes.
You can hear me now, Madam Chair?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Derek Smith. I'm a practicing psychiatrist. I was head of children and women's psychiatry in Vancouver for 30 years, and I've been personally involved in 2 cases involving psychiatric illness and a MAID, both of them whom have received MAID incidentally. There have been, you've heard enough on the real.
Sorry, Dr. Smith, your sound is going in and out. We're only catching a few of your words. So I wonder if there is a technical issue.
I don't know. I'll try
again. Okay, would you continue now? Yes, thank you.
Good. So I'm talking about the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses, and there's good research that shows that psychiatric diagnoses are as reliable as other medical diagnoses. And this is in spite of the fact that we don't have biological markers like blood tests or x-rays to make psychiatric diagnoses. And the reason for that is that the brain's a very complicated organ and we don't understand it. However, the courts have certainly relied on psychiatric diagnoses over many years. And in fact, the case, the Truchon case in Quebec, which has ended up with Bill C-7 being introduced, relied extensively on psychiatric diagnosis. And the Madam Justice found that psychiatrists can make accurate diagnoses. In my opening statements, which you have, I've included a table showing that compared to other medical diagnoses, that psychiatric diagnoses are just as reliable. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is psychiatric illness irremediable? Mental illness usually isn't a terminal illness unless you're looking at conditions like Alzheimer's. But under current law, one does not have to have a terminal illness as a requirement for MAID. I think it's instructive to look at the case A.B. from Ontario, where a judge granted MAID for a woman who had osteoarthritis. This is not a condition that is terminal or usually results in death. The judge agreed to providing MAID for A.B. Because she looked at the whole person. One cannot look just at a diagnosis. You have to understand the nature of the human experience of the person who's sitting in front of you. So don't rely entirely on what the diagnosis is. It's the person that we're interested in here. In a more recent decision, Justice Baudin granted Jean Truchon, a disabled man, his request for MAID. And in the judgment, which I'm sure you've had at paragraph 466, it says, physicians involved are able to distinguish a suicidal patient from a patient seeking medical assistance and dying. That was one of her conclusions. So unlike the previous witness, I think when it's tried in a court of law, the judge has accepted that the psychiatrist can distinguish between suicidal thinking and people who are seeking MAID, and I'm in agreement with that. Now, irremediable is a term that's used when there are no more treatments available that are, quote, acceptable to the patient. Under law, the patient cannot be forced to take any types of treatments that are available. They must agree. And if a person refuses additional treatment, therefore, I would consider them to be irremediable. One of the major controversies in psychiatry is, should people with depression be forced to have electroconvulsive therapy? And I think the law is quite clear. The patient must agree. And if they don't agree, there are no other treatments available. And then the person has an irremediable condition. Now, we're not talking about here about people who have been depressed for a day or, have had the 6 months of a distress. We're talking about people who have been psychiatrically ill for years and have tried many different treatments, medications, psychotherapy, and so on. So all the cases that you've heard quoted from the Netherlands, these are all chronic patients with many years of a treatment. The next thing I want to speak about is, do the vulnerable need protection? And again, this has been tried in court in both the Carter case and the Truchon case, and there is no evidence that vulnerable people are at risk for MAID. In fact, if you look at the actual people who are receiving MAID, they are typically white, well-educated, and well-off. You could easily argue that the marginalized communities are disadvantaged because they're not accessing MAID. And the Justice Boudin in the Truchon case equally found findings that the disadvantaged are not being taken advantage of, and that you must do each case at a time. So I thought I would talk to you about the two cases I've been involved with. The one was a woman, EF, This was extensively reviewed by Madam Justice Boudin in her judgment. EF was a woman with a conversion disorder. She'd had the condition for about 10 years. It's a complicated psychiatric neurological condition. In the end, a justice in the Queen's Bench granted her MAID. The Attorney General of Canada appealed it, and the Court of Appeal granted it based entirely on a psychiatric diagnosis. Now, that was before Bill C-14. When the rules flowed out of the Carter decision. So we know from Carter that psychiatric illness was not an exclusion. If you look carefully at Bill C-14, there is nothing that excludes psychiatric patients. Again, this was a finding from Madam Justice Boudin in the Truchon case. I personally was involved with a woman who was in her 40s. She'd had an eating disorder for many, many years. She'd had every known treatment. The family was richly resourced. She'd been to treatment centers in the United States. I interviewed her and her father, who was a retired Supreme Court justice. Her father said knowingly that he understood the situation, and it broke his heart to agree with his daughter that she needed an assisted death, but in the end, that was his opinion that she should have an assisted death. And after a full assessment program, she did have an assisted death. So that's the only two patients that I'm aware of that I've been personally involved with. The numbers across Canada up to this point are enormously small, and they will incidentally continue to be small as well. If we look at the tsunami of psychiatric patients lining up, applying for MAID and being approved for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Smith.
Merci.
Mr. Roberge for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, chairs and honorable members of the committee. My name is David Roberge, and I am a member of the End of Life Working Group of the Canadian Bar Association. On behalf of the CBA, thank you for the opportunity to address this committee. L'Association du Barreau canadien est un...
The CBA is a national organization which covers 36,000 jurists across the country. Our working group on the end of life has members who represent various areas of expertise, including constitutional law, human rights law, and more. The Canadian Bar Association has studied the law around end of life and has taken a pan-Canadian approach to this subject, which would be in conformity with the ruling of the Supreme Court in Carter.
Is complex and raises important issues and diverse views. This is perhaps even more so in cases of mental illness. The CBA recognizes the importance of appropriate healthcare and social support for people living with mental illness. Meanwhile, we must realize that the suffering of these individuals is no less real than those of individuals with physical illness. As such, the framework should recognize the right of persons with mental illness to make their own healthcare decisions, including MAID, in a manner that balances autonomy and appropriate safeguards. In a nutshell, the CBA's position regarding the issue of MAID and mental illness as the sole underlying medical condition is the following. Firstly, Parliament should authorize MAID in some cases of mental illness, pursuant to a patient-centric approach and provided appropriate safeguards are in place. Deuxièmement, le Parlement devrait...
Second, Parliament should make sure that additional protections should bring in the expert opinion and should make sure that with informed consent that a patient should not have to endure prolonged suffering.
Ensure that MAID in cases of mental illness aligns with current best practices in mental health care. While some issues pertaining to MAID and mental illness would be more appropriately addressed by medical experts, the CBA wishes to highlight key considerations on the topic of appropriate safeguards from a legal perspective. D'abord, sur la portée de la loi.
With respect to the scope of the law, Parliament has to define the scope of MAID with respect to the protocols and measures that will be enforced. With respect to the expertise of the assessor, given the inherent complexity of the subject, Parliament may want to specify that one of the assessors or evaluators should be a psychiatrist. There would have to be access to these specialists and in a short order so that suffering is not prolonged.
Currently, for situations where natural death is not foreseeable, at least 90 days must elapse between the initial request and the administration of MAID. An appropriate period is required to enable MAID assessor to conduct a full review of the patient's circumstances. Parliament must be mindful of the risk of arbitrariness in setting time limits, irrespective of the nature of the mental disorder. Au sujet maintenant du consentement éclairé.
With respect to informed consent, the consent we want to see is something where someone has been offered appropriate therapeutics. In order to strengthen the criteria for informed consent, we feel that we should be mindful of the standards in provinces and in professional associations.
Of irremediable medical conditions, the views of medical experts on what is considered an irremediable mental illness may vary. Parliament should thus align with best practices in mental health care. As a reminder, the Supreme Court of Canada and Carter specified that irremediable does not require individuals to undertake treatments that are not acceptable to them. On behalf of the CBA, let me thank you once again for inviting us today, and I welcome questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Roberge, and to all of our witnesses. So we will go into our first round, and each member will have 5 minutes. So first it's Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my questions to Dr. Bishara. Dr. Bishara, the final report of the expert panel concluded that on the question of irremediability in the case of mental illness, that can be reasonably satisfied based on the evolution and response of the patient to past interventions and treatments. In other words, if they haven't, if treatments and interventions haven't worked, haven't made them better over a period of time, that would suffice to satisfy the requirement of irremediability. I'd be curious as to your thoughts, and that was also stated by Dr. Smith.
I believe that Dr. Smith confuses irremediability of the diagnosis and the reliability of giving a diagnosis with the question of irremediability of the symptoms which lead to a request for MAID. Yes, you can reliably determine that someone has schizophrenia or suffers from depression, but the vast majority of people with those mental illnesses will not seriously consider suicide or request MAID or have severe untreated symptoms that would lead them to want to die. I'm a scientist. The latest Cochrane review of research on the ability to find some indicator of the future course of a mental illness, either treated or untreated, concluded that we have no specific scientific ways of doing this. So we are relying on the clinical hunch of a person who hasn't known the person for 20 or 30 years, who is no scientific data showing that they can determine this. I accept that many mental illnesses are not remediable, but that doesn't mean that a person with proper treatment will not have a good and full life despite the fact of having a mental illness. And the real issue is in suicide prevention, every single person who calls a crisis line meets the MAID criteria. They are suffering, they feel it's interminable, and they often have refused treatments. The difference between Canada and every other country in the world is elsewhere in the world, if the physicians feel there is a treatment, the person doesn't have to do the treatment. It's up to them, but they don't kill them.
Sorry to interrupt, and I want to just allow you to pick up on that point, because Dr. Smith said in the case of the Benelux countries, a very small number of persons who access MAID suffer from a sole underlying mental illness condition. So hence, there's nothing to worry about. And I think that ties in.
The number who are accepted are fairly small. In 2016, in the Netherlands, it was about 1,500 people who requested, and they have a very detailed protocol, which takes an average of 10 months of assessments and evaluation. And of those 1,000, almost 500, they accepted 60 of those cases after spending more time with the patients than most mental patients receive in psychotherapy in Canada over the course of 10 or 15 years. The number who request it is fairly substantial. In those countries, the number that are accepted, because they have this criteria, if they believe there's some treatment, whether the person wants it or not, that's their choice. But they feel that the state is not obliged to end the lives of people who can be treated.
Right. And
so there's about 10 seconds,
Mr.
Cooper.
I guess my time, Madam Chair, therefore has expired.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'll have Monsieur Arsenault for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Coprésidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your very valuable assistance today. Dr. Smith, Professor Smith, you reassure me when you say that your profession is able to distinguish between two trends or two tendencies when it comes to mental problems. When someone is suicidal and asking for MAID. Can you speak a little more about how the profession can decide that someone simply suffers, that someone suffers enough to ask for MAID?
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Arsenault, for that question. I'm sorry I cannot answer you in French. I'll do my best in English. I think the detailed answer is in this report, which you have, which you've received already, the report of the expert panel on MAID and mental illness. I'm not going to be able to go over that in 5 minutes, but I want to reassure you again that I've mentioned previously that in court, this has been tried, not with a bunch of opinion, but cross-examination demanding hard evidence. And the hard evidence in the Touchon case was there is a vigorous and strict process in place for MAID in Canada that has no problems with it. And the second one, that physicians are able to distinguish between a suicidal patient and a patient seeking medical assistance in dying. Those are established facts from the courts. We have no difficulty making these facts known when we're in court, because there you must not just have opinion, you must have facts, and the facts can be tried. There can be cross-examination and new evidence introduced. So I want to assure you that as a practicing psychiatrist, we see people with suicidal thinking all the time as part and parcel of psychiatry. I personally have no problems separating a patient who is having suicidal ideation from a person who is seeking MAID. For one thing, the person seeking MAID has probably been suffering with psychiatric illness for 8 to 10 years. We're not talking here about an 18-year-old woman who suddenly got depressed and is having suicidal thoughts and is looking for MAID. That kind of patient is not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who have suffered interminably over a number of years.
Merci, monsieur. Docteur, il faut que j'aille vite, j'ai pas beaucoup.
Thank you, Doctor. I have to go quickly. I don't have much time. Professor Smith, what would you say to people who contradict what you've just said? For example, Dr. Mishara said that there is no proof that a mental illness is not reversible.
Well, again, at the risk of being repetitive, I want to go back to the court decisions. The court decisions are where facts are established and rulings made. And the honorable gentleman's opinions were tested in court and found not to hold any water. So the court clearly found, when they heard all the evidence from a whole bunch of experts, including psychiatrists, people for and against, that psychiatrists are clearly able to distinguish between people who are suicidal and people who are seeking aid. So I rely on court decisions because the facts are the crucible of truth comes out of the cross-examination.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce qu'il me reste un peu de temps, Madame?
Thank you very much. Do I have time left, Madam Chair, for our last question? Mr. Roberge, so you're representing the 36,000 members of the Canadian Bar Association. I read your report, and I want to know if there were among the safeguards, if we are to allow MAID for people who have mental illness, how would you compare the safeguards, the present safeguards, versus those you might propose? Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, at this stage, the Canadian Bar Association has no specific recommendations. We have decided to simply express the legal parameters that should be borne in mind so that measures that are adopted will respect the Carter decision and the rule of law. If you allow, I think you're referring to going to seeing what experts in the field might suggest to us in order to come up with these safeguards. Now, is that what the Canadian Bar Association thinks?
So I will have to move on. Thank you. Monsieur Thériault for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask a certain question. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have a legal expert with us. So, Mr. Roberge, we know that at the present time, Quebec has its report of the Special Commission, and they want that the bill that was tabled this morning, I think, would open the door to possibilities for mental health. Well, let's suppose that we make that particular recommendation and with a sunset clause in place. What would this look like in terms of concordance? Would Quebec be obliged to proceed? Would it have a certain wiggle room? Because we know that regulatory frameworks in the Criminal Code, but health is managed by provinces. Well, I'm here as a representative of a working group of the Canadian Bar Association. We didn't look at that specifically, so I can't make a specific comment about it, because we really don't have concrete data. But what I can tell you on behalf of our association is that on several occasions we have underscored the importance of a pan-Canadian approach and harmonized legislation. In the Trichon case, the Quebec court talked about conflicts in legislation, so there was particular attention that was given to the two levels of legislation. Well, there are people who have said, when they were talking about other facets of MAID, they said that the legislation or the rule that was enforced in practice on the ground was one thing. Do you believe that this is a principle that could hold in these cases? Well, once again, this isn't within the mandate of our working group. It's always difficult to compare various regimes because sometimes there are provisions that might be more restrictive and others that might be more permissive. So it would be difficult for me to look at this abstractly and comment. Thank you. Dr. Smith, what I've understood from the expert report that was tabled, patients who might ask for MAID are those who might not have access to it. People who have personality disorders, which might lead them to suicidal ideation, they could not have easy access to this. Am I wrong in my interpretation?
Dr. Smith? Dr. Smith? There must be a sound
there.
Oh, yes.
I've unmuted myself. Thank you for that question. It comes back to the point I made, which has come up repeatedly in the court decisions, that it's the whole person that you look at, not the diagnosis. Now, when I first saw cases on the Benelux countries with personality disorder, I thought that this was terrible, that there must have been a mistake. I went to Belgium and I sat down with my colleagues there and we went over the cases in great detail. The devil is in the details with this. You're looking at the whole person, not a diagnosis. So the people who have had personality disorders and received MAID have been suffering for years and years and years with an intractable illness that is typically resistant to medication, frequently resistant to psychotherapy, and is causing them enormous distress. So you have to let go of the notion of what the diagnosis is and focus on what the suffering of the person is. And this is why the courts have been so effective, because they only have one or two people in front of them at one time. They can look very carefully at it.
Okay, merci.
Excuse me for interrupting. In the recommendations, there are a number of safeguards that do come out of it. There are things like incurability. The incurability of a mental problem might be established even in the absence of various interventions. This means that it's not during a state of crisis, but where it has been established that the mental issue is chronic, and this is why the person might be eligible for MAID. Have I misunderstood?
Time is up. A very quick response, Dr. Smith.
Yes. I think these are people with chronic illnesses that have been suffering for many, many years. And incidentally, I agree entirely with all the recommendations in the final report of the expert panel. I had nothing to do with this expert panel. I came at it as an interested party, and I read it. I have no problems with any of those recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we'll have Mr. McGregor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. And I too, following other committee members, would like to thank our witnesses for helping guide this committee through this very important study. Professor Smith, maybe I'll start with you. You know, the report that we've been discussing has noted that the presence of many of the mental disorders have been strongly correlated with certain social, economic, and environmental inequalities, you know, poverty, unemployment, homelessness. I know in my own riding of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford, we are going through some really bad effects of the opioids crisis. A lot of people suffering through a lot of trauma. I know you did state in your opening statement that, you know, there's with respect to vulnerable people, But I'd still like you to expand a little bit because I do see on the streets of my riding in my own communities a lot of people who are obviously suffering from mental disorders, a lot of internal anguish, and I guess we as a committee we just want to ensure that might those inequalities that we see ever influence a person with a mental illness to make a request for medical assistance in dying? Because I'm just worried that there's such an inequitable access to proper services for so many people out there.
Sorry, Dr. Smith?
There, I've gotten myself off unmute. Yes, there's no doubt a great inequality of access to services, and many people with psychiatric illnesses are disadvantaged for getting the kinds of treatment they need. But I think that's becoming true in all other parts of medicine as well. I know in my province, almost 1 million people don't have a family doctor. So we're facing a crisis with access to healthcare. That's why I think that you have to look at the individual case, not groups of people who may be disadvantaged, but the individual patient who's sitting down in front of you having a discussion about whether MAID is an option for them or not. They probably will have accessed many services by that point. If they've accessed no services, then of course, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, I'm going to recommend they have treatment. The people who are doing assessments are not blind to the treatment thing. And if there's an obvious treatment that could be offered to the person to relieve their suffering, then by all means, we would try to not only recommend it, but arrange it. So we're not talking about people who have never been treated or can't access service. We're talking about people who have been in treatment for years and years and are not improving and are still suffering interminably. So we should all work to get rid of inequalities in the healthcare system, particularly for disadvantaged communities. But I don't think that that's necessarily much to do with the psychiatric illness and MAID.
And just a follow-up, there's the requirement in the criminal code is that, a person who is seeking MAID is capable of making decisions with respect to their health. Is there anything that you would like our committee to take note of, if there are any issues when you're assessing the capacity of a person with a mental illness to make a request for MAID? Anything that we need to just really take note of? Does the criminal code need some finessing in that respect?
Yes, well, there's no doubt that a competency assessment is a part and parcel of every MAID assessment. Doctors do this all the time because we can't do a single service with a patient. We can't do surgery or do psychotherapy or give medications without permission, and the person must be competent. So doctors do this routinely. In the case of MAID, however, you may need to up the ante a little bit and ensure that there are instruments like the McCarthy competency tests or other instruments which can be used. The competency part of the assessment takes a good chunk of time. We want to make sure that before recommending someone for MAID that they are truly competent. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that psychiatric patients, like everyone else, are assumed to be competent until they're proven otherwise. So we don't assume that just because you have a schizophrenia or depression or a personality disorder, you're not competent. You are considered to be competent until we show otherwise.
Thank you.
There's less than 30 seconds.
Okay, well, maybe I'll leave it there, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I'll turn this over now to our co-chair, Mr. Garneau.
Merci beaucoup, Sénatrice Martin. Nous allons...
Thank you, Senator Martin. And now we will begin the question period for senators. And since Senator Dalphond is not with us today, we will allow 4 minutes to each of the 3 first senators. And we will begin with Senator Mégy. Senator Mégy, you have 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for your help in helping us come to a decision. My question is for Dr. Smith. Are there mental illnesses, diagnosed mental illnesses that would have greater force in leading one to say that the illness was incurable? Now, I know that you would have to do all the the appropriate investigations and take all appropriate considerations, but are there certain kinds of mental illness that could be determined incurable? Do they exist?
Yes, thank you for that question. There are certainly forms of mental illness which are incurable and terminal, and I'm referring here to the dementias. The Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementias are all going to kill people eventually. So that's certainly one category of psychiatric illness in which there is no debate about that. But it's not whether the illness is incurable. Some people would have us believe that we should hold on for years and years waiting for some new treatment to come down the line. What that's doing is prolonging the suffering of a person who is actively seeking their death to relieve intolerable suffering. So I don't think incurable is necessarily what we want to look at. We want to look at are there treatments available that are acceptable to the person who has been through 10 years of treatment that is going to improve their functioning? And if the answer to that is no, in other words, there are no treatments, or there may be some treatments, but they're not acceptable to the patient, then in my understanding of the law, is that they are eligible for consideration for MAID.
Merci. Une autre question encore à vous.
Thank you. Another question for you, Doctor. You know that in our society there is great stigma with respect to mental illness. This is something that is quite prevalent. How might that influence a clinician when he or she is assessing someone who's asking for MAID?
Yes, well, that's a very interesting question as well. I have to tell you that when people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm a medical doctor. I'm a medical doctor first and a psychiatrist second. The seat of all psychiatric illness is the human brain, which the last time I looked was part of the body and part of the human experience. Our personality, as we describe it, lies in the frontal lobes of our brain. So I'm very much opposed to this dichotomy between physical illness and mental illness. I mean, these are all disorders of the human body, in this case, mostly the human brain. So I don't have a problem sorting out whether people should or shouldn't. We have pretty clear criteria that are put down in the legislation. We have a new criteria in C7, a skilled clinician who knows what they're up to in psychiatry, a second assessor, and maybe even talking to the family doctors, to the patient's family. These assessments take literally hours and involve a wide variety of people: the patient, the doctor, a couple of assessors, the patient's family. I can remember one assessment I did where I spent 3 hours talking to each of the children of a man who was seeking MAID. I want to make sure what everybody's opinion is, but in the end, it's up to the individual person, but we want to listen to what other people have to say when approaching that decision.
Merci beaucoup, sénatrice. Nous allons passer maintenant.
Thank you, Senator. Now we'll go to Senator Kutcher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First question, very short answer, please, Dr. Mishara. In your testimony, you talked about MAID assessments. Have you ever conducted a MAID assessment?
Did a MAID assessment, but I have certainly assessed
no. Thank
large
you very much.
numbers of people who wanted to have their lives ended.
That's fine. We're talking about MAID, sir. Okay, Chair, could you ask Dr. Bashir to provide to this committee in writing in a timely manner the evidence for a couple of assertions he made? He was talking about conducting MAID assessments, and he said that large numbers of mistakes are made in the MAID assessment. So could he give us the evidence for that? The other thing that he said is, quote, every single person that calls a suicide prevention line meets the MAID criteria, end of quote. And could he provide us with the evidence for that as well? Thank you.
Okay, Senator, I will follow up with the clerk, with Mr. Mishara after this meeting.
Thank you so much. For Dr. Smith, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada has standards for psychiatric competencies. And in those competencies, they expect a psychiatrist to be able to conduct capacity assessments, competency assessments, cognitive performance assessments, and to assess and manage suicidal behavior. Now, do you as a MAID assessor and a psychiatrist have the capacity and competencies to conduct these assessments properly and thoroughly?
So we're not getting an answer. That was directed.
No, sorry. I've got the mute button. Takes a while to come up. Yes, I don't want to be overly enthused or be stating things that are not true for me, but I think all psychiatrists in Canada, we have a vigorous training and licensing system. And I think any psychiatrist who wants to is competent to do all of those things. We have to assess a competency on a case-by-case basis, on a regular basis. We have to look at capacity. We have to take into account the views of the family of the patient, the family doctor who has referred the patient. These are all things that happen routinely. So when it comes to MAID, you're not looking at a unique set of skills. You're looking at using the same skills that psychiatrists have in a particular, to answer a particular question, and that is the person who's seeking assistance in dying, who's sitting in front of you, do they meet the criteria established under law? And that's the basis of a MAID assessment. That may take 3 hours to do that, but that is really what we're up to. We're doing a clinical assessment and interpreting the clinical findings and against the requirements in the law for assisted dying.
And if you, as an assessor, are not certain about whether the person is suicidal, or if you're not certain about whether the person has the capacity to provide free and informed consent, what's your standard procedure? How do you go ahead?
As with all patients where I'm not certain, I get a second opinion. I mean, there's nothing that says you only have to have two assessors. If I don't do a lot of assessment, the assessments I get involved with are where there are two assessors and they can't decide on an issue that involves psychiatric illness. So we're at liberty to call up our colleagues, bring in other assessors. We want to make sure we get this right. Like this is an irrevocable decision. This is not a decision that anyone takes lightly. Not the people who assess, not the patient, not their family, not the providers. We must make sure that we get it right. And I think we're using the skills of the psychiatrists and the backup of our colleagues in the community. We have ample resources to get this right and assessing an individual patient.
Thank you very much, Senator Kutcher. We'll now go to Senator Wallin. Senator Wallin, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we're having problems with the video there. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Great, thank you. I'd like to go back to Dr. Smith as well, and just to follow up on something that Dr. Kutcher raised. When it is stated that everyone who calls a suicide prevention hotline is eligible for MAID, I would gather that you don't agree with that.
Thank you for that question. I not only do I disagree with that, I think it's preposterous. People can call suicide hotlines who have having a situational adjustment. They've broken up with a loved one in their family. They've been fired from their job. These are not the kinds of patients who we're thinking about for MAID at all. We're talking about patients who have been suffering from mental illness, psychiatric illness, diagnosable illness, have been treated for multiple years by multiple treatments, seeing many psychiatrists and therapists. That is the sort of person who is likely to be eligible for MAID. The vast majority of people who call suicide hotlines are nowhere close to being considered for MAID. That's really a red herring.
Okay, I would also like to follow up with you on your comments about Alzheimer's and dementia, which are an extreme form of mental illness. And again, it comes back to the issue here, which is if that is the case, and if mental illness can in fact be the sole reason to access MAID, we come back to the issue of advance requests here, because how else could that happen for somebody that was going down that particular road? How do you look at that dilemma?
Yes, thank you. This is one of my passions in life. I think we're all facing, unfortunately, a wave of dementia that's going to affect most of the people in this room and on this conference call. The other issue is competent minors and psychiatric patients. These are small numbers of patients. The tsunami is dementia. And the problem currently is that if you wait too long to apply for MAID, you're going to become incompetent. And if you become incompetent, then you are sentenced to 5 years of sitting around in a home in adult diapers, not knowing who you are, not knowing who your family is, not enjoying life in the least bit for 5 or 6 years. So the risk of waiting too long is to have to live through dementia. I've seen it. It's not pretty. The other risk is you make the decision too early. I have a friend who was a wife of a physician who had MAID a year and a half ago. She did not want to go down the road to dementia. She had MAID, in my view, much too early. Even though she qualified, she missed seeing 2 of her grandchildren because she did not want to take the risk of dementia. So yes, I'm all in favor of advance requests for people with dementia.
But you see these as part of the mental illness category, in a sense.
Yes, they're part of the functioning of the brain, and this is why I think, again, we have this dichotomy between dementia and, say, depression. We understand exactly what dementia is about. We're not quite sure what depression is, but we do know they're both disorders of the brain. So I would much prefer that we were discussing brain disorders and not psychiatric illness or mental illness.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator Wallen. We'll now go to Senator Martin for 3 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses that are bringing your expertise to the table. And Dr. Mishara, I've noted that you have worked as a clinician in suicide prevention and end-of-life care for 50 years. So in your opinion, does MAID for mental illness blur the line between suicide prevention and suicide assistance? And is it possible to establish this line under MAID regime?
If it were possible to establish that, those very few rare cases where a person is doomed to suffer interminably, there would be no debate. If you look at the expert panel report carefully and you try to find some indication of how you differentiate between someone who's suicidal and someone who's requesting MAID, that's all they say repeatedly, quote, "It is not possible to provide fixed rules." They do not cite a single research study that shows that any human being is capable of differentiating between those two groups. When Dr. Smith was asked, how do you determine if someone's suicidal or they're requesting MAID, he did not give any diagnostic criteria that one could apply, but he said he's capable of doing this. The research is very clear. It's just there is no evidence that you can predict the course of a mental illness, either treated or untreated, using any reliable criteria. And the research having different psychiatrists predict shows that they don't usually agree. So this worries me, because all the seriously suicidal, I'll repeat this, and I'd love to provide the evidence that Dr. Kushner, Senator Kushner requested, is when someone is seriously suicidal, they feel there's no hope. And we are allowed to, against their will, send an ambulance to save someone's life who's in the process or on the verge of killing themselves. And most of them, the vast majority, are very thankful that you did that at that time. And they do meet the criteria in the sense that they usually had long history of mental illness, and they had lots of treatments, and they're feeling totally hopeless at that moment. But they made a mistake. And how many people who were so grateful to be alive when against their will they were saved? And I just am so worried that people will needlessly die because we do not have any criteria. Even though people believe I can make that decision, the scientific evidence isn't there. And I challenge you to just look at the expert panel report and try to find what the criteria would be. How someone talking to someone will make that determination.
Thank you very much, Senator Martin. And that brings us to the end of our panel, but I want to thank our three witnesses today, Mr. Mishara, Dr. Derek Smith, and Monsieur David Roberge. Merci beaucoup pour vos témoignages.
Thank you for your testimony today.
Our questions on this very difficult but very important topic. We very much appreciate it. With that, we will conclude panel number one. We'll suspend momentarily in preparation for the next panel. Mr. Clerk, please let me know when we're set up with the witnesses to begin panel number two. Thank you. two witnesses who are with us at the moment. From the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, we have Sean Krausert. And as an individual, we have Dr. Valerie Masuda. And very shortly, we hope to have Dr. Kwame McKenzie, also as an individual. Thank you for joining us today. The way we run these things is that you will each have a chance to make a 5-minute opening statement. We ask you to respect that 5 minutes. Please, during the actual panel, put yourself on mute when you're not speaking. If you want to draw our attention to something during the testimony, you can use the raise hand feature, and please address your comments through the co-chairs. I'm accompanied today by Senator Jana Martin, who will co-preside some of this session. So without further ado, we will start. And Mr. Krausert, if you are ready, please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, honorable members of this special joint committee. I am Sean Krausert, the Executive Director for the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments as you undertake the statutory review of provisions of the Criminal Code relating to medical assistance in dying and their application. My organization acknowledges that Canadians who are deemed capable to make such decisions ought to be able to access MAID to exert control over a death process that is already happening. At the same time, efforts to prevent suicide, including healthy messaging across society, means that we must work towards a future where no Canadian uses death as a remedy for a difficult and painful life, especially when the challenges being faced by the individual are curable or remediable. I have several concerns with respect to MAID for those not at the end of life and suffering solely from a mental disorder. 3 of them are policy considerations and 1 is very personal. First, a life worth living. It is imperative that as a society we invest in finding ways to alleviate suffering and support people in connecting to a life worth living. Expansion of MAID to include those not at the end of life carries the inherent assumption that some lives are not worth living and cannot be made so. Second, mental health care. Finding hope and reasons to live are quintessential aspects of clinical care in mental disorders. Having MAID as a treatment option is in fundamental conflict with this approach and is likely to have a negative impact on the effectiveness of some therapeutic interventions, which may lead both patient and provider to prematurely abandon care. Third, psychiatric policy. Ending the life of someone with complex mental health problems is simpler and likely much less expensive than offering outstanding ongoing care. This creates a perverse incentive for the health system to encourage the use of MAID at the expense of providing adequate resources to patients, and that outcome is unacceptable. And fourth, my personal story. I likely wouldn't be here today had the option of MAID been available to me in my darkest days. I experienced multiple deep depressions and extreme anxiety through my 20s and 30s. During my worst depression in my late 30s, the pain was unbearable. While I experienced suicidal ideation, I later realized that I actually didn't want to die, but rather end the pain. That ambivalence is common with those considering killing themselves. While I once saw myself as a burden to my family, I now see that I'm a benefit, and not only to them, but to my community. I am now relatively depression and anxiety free, thanks to medication and therapy that finally worked, as well as finding out I had severe sleep apnea that had been undiagnosed for decades. Now I have a rich life, recently elected as the mayor of my town, and my first grandchild will be born in a few weeks. To think that if in my darkest, most painful time I had been given the option of MAID, I might have given up on a future that was better than I could have asked or even imagined. CASP believes that we need to consider the broader context of suicide prevention and life promotion for all Canadians. To this end, we recommend MAID should not be provided to patients suffering from a condition that does not have a reasonable foreseeability of death unless there is a clear scientific evidence that the condition is irremediable. Irremediability must always be objective and never subjective. There is no evidence that concludes mental illness falls into this category. 2, increased funding should be available for healthcare to ensure that treatments are available to patients so that lack of access to treatment does not cause the condition to be deemed irremediable. A patient's refusal to receive treatment should also not equate to irremediability. Third, extreme caution needs to be taken with MAID, and a thought-out, fail-proof, measured system of safeguards needs to be in place so that those most vulnerable will be protected in order that MAID does not become doctor-assisted suicide. Fourth, tools should be made available to healthcare providers, especially MAID decision makers, on how to move forward with providing support to the patient in order to avoid premature death. In short, CASP strongly encourages removal of mental disorder as a condition eligible for medical assistance in dying. To do so will safeguard against the premature death of persons who are suffering from mental illness alone, and thereby avoiding inadvertently legitimizing suicide as an acceptable option for ending a difficult and painful life. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Krausert. We'll now go to Dr. Valerie Masuda. Dr. Masuda, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, honorable members, for allowing me to present my views to the Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying, considering the access of MAID for chronic mental illness. My name is Valerie Masuda. I've been in medical practice for over 30 years, specializing in emergency medicine for 20 years and in palliative care for over 10 years. I am a MAID assessor, and I've been supporting patients with their applications for MAID since May 2016. I also work on Vancouver Island, which has the highest rates of MAID deaths in Canada. And I'm also a physician certified in the provision of psychedelic assisted therapy for terminally ill patients suffering from irremediable demoralization, depression, and anxiety. My work in MAID has shown me the scope of reasons why patients wish to end their life prematurely. Some patients consider dying from increasing debility and dependency and decreasing cognition an option intolerable to them. And some avail themselves of MAID if they anticipate severe symptoms at end of life. And some patients with end-stage chronic disease may experience very extended periods of debility and suffering. And although their prognosis is unpredictable, they are still on a drying trajectory. As a palliative physician, my duty is to ensure that I've provided the patient with every available method to alleviate their suffering, even as I may support their application for MAID. The most difficult symptom to treat is demoralization, or the terror that patients experience related to their diagnosis. In the past, we had no treatment other than to sedate these people to alleviate this deep, deep suffering. But more recently, some have been choosing MAID to have this state released, which is intolerable to them. Over the past 3 years, I have legally and successfully treated 20 patients suffering from irremediable demoralization, fear, and depression under a Section 56 exemption or the Special Access Program. I treat these patients with psilocybin, which is a psychedelic medicine which is highly efficacious and safe. With one treatment, I've witnessed a total alleviation of demoralization and fear. It is a treatment now that I offer to patients who I see suffering from this kind of distress, who may have otherwise accessed MAID. I understand that some patients with chronic mental illness believe their suffering is intractable and they should be able to terminate their suffering with medical assistance, but I do not support this. Firstly, medical assistance in dying is a program designed to support dying people. Secondly, our Hippocratic oath is to cause no harm. Delivering a lethal injection to a patient who is not on a dying trajectory is causing harm. And third, chronic mental illness is an extremely complex and multifactorial condition. It's often caused by early childhood trauma and abuse. It's compounded by unemployment, poverty, isolation, homelessness. And the demoralization and hopelessness are self-treated with substances. And the lack of resources for these people perpetuates and compounds the suffering. The promise of pharmaceutical companies to cure depression and anxiety was a lie. 9% of Canadians take antidepressants, and chronic antidepressant use has increased. And a quarter of Canadians suffer from depression. And as a result, we are seeing a crisis in substance use and an epidemic of drug-related deaths. For some patients, despite pharmaceuticals and hospitalizations and dramatic interventions such as ECT, the demoralization and hopelessness and depression remains. Their mental suffering appears to be permanently imprinted in their brains, and in many cases, substance use becomes a deeply established behavior response. These patients are considered treatment resistant because they have not responded to conventional therapy. I've had the opportunity to study the effects of psychedelic therapy in my palliative patients, and with the proper supports and treatment context, the medicines reset the brain and give an enormous opportunity to change thoughts and behavior patterns. But unfortunately, they're restricted drugs and unavailable to patients outside of clinical trials. So in summary, Canadians suffering from depression have a constitutional right to have their suffering alleviated, but I do not believe through MAID. Canadians should not have medically assisted suicide because they lack access to basic mental health resources and basic living needs. Pharmaceuticals are not the answer to treating mental illness, and Canadians need access to effective and publicly funded treatment programs using publicly funded therapists and access to psychedelic treatments. Effectively treating mental illness gets people back to work. It reduces poverty and homelessness, decreases hospital utilization, decreases crime, and stimulates the economy. This is where I believe the answer to our mental health crisis lies. If this special joint committee on MAID recommends on proceeding with allowing access to MAID for chronic mental conditions, I recommend there be a robust multidisciplinary review process involving physicians and psychiatrists, social workers, and ethicists involved in a patient's MAID application, and that there is a transparent review of MAID cases shared between health authorities, provincial and federal oversights, so we can ensure we are not treating social problems with euthanasia. Thank you very much.
Dr. Masuda. Mr. Clerk, was Dr. McKenzie able to join us?
Dr. McKenzie's still attempting to join. We have asked him for a contact phone number where we can call him to assist him. We're just waiting for his reply, but he's attempting to join.
Okay, so given that, I'm going to start the question period because we do need to proceed at this point. Unfortunately, Dr. McKenzie will try to fit him in at a future meeting because we need to start with the question period at this point. And I will now turn it over to my co-chair, Senator Yonah Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Garneau. We'll begin with the 5-minute questions from MPs, and we'll start with Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Mr. Krausert, you said in your testimony that there's no evidence that mental health falls into the category of irremediability. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I'm advised by those such as at the CAMH in Toronto that they have no evidence. Other prominent researchers in the area, Dr. Mashara, Dr. Senior, and there's just no evidence. I mean, that the studies would have to be done.
Thank you for that. Dr. Masuda, as a MAID assessor, the expert panel report in the case of mental illness acknowledges that it would be, quote, difficult to predict for a given individual in terms of whether they can get better, but that it would be sufficient to take into account past interventions and treatments and determine irremediability on that basis. Could you comment on that in the case of mental illness?
Certainly. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I have had a lot of experience in my emergency department lifetime, seeing chronic illness coming back and forth. Patients, I think, get into a point of great darkness. And this is where we see patients who attempt suicide. And often these patients have had many, many, many interventions in the past. And we know that some of them do recover. We know that some patients with substance abuse do recover. And so when we talk about it being irremediable, how do we predict which patients are going to recover from intervention or not? And I think saying, a patient has had 3 courses of different antidepressants is not a predictability, does not give predictability whether or not this is not recoverable. And certainly with more and more science behind the use of medications that have been restricted and not accessible by psychiatrists or therapists, we are starting to see that there is a potential for recovery for these patients. And so when we look at what does irremediable mean in mental illness, I think it's very difficult to predict, to say that this person has tried a lot of things, but their depression they cannot recover from.
Thank you for that. And now Dr. Smith, in his testimony, said you have to look at the patient as a whole, and he seemed to focus almost singularly upon suffering. But the last time I checked the criminal code and looked at the definition of what constitutes an irremediable condition, intolerable suffering is one of the 3 criteria, but it is not the only criteria. The other 2 are an incurable illness and there being an irreversible state of decline. And as I understand what you're saying, is it's not possible to determine if there is an incurable illness and that the patient is in an irreversible state of decline, because there's always the possibility to get better, and therefore it's not possible to establish irremediability. Am I correct?
I would say that this is correct. And the inevitable decline also is of question for people with mental illness, because what we're saying is they have this mental illness and we expect them to never get better and that they're going to continue to get worse. And I'm not sure that that is established as well.
Thank you. Mr. Krausert, as someone who had suffered from mental illness and did get better and has gone on to live a very successful or seemingly successful and happy life, can you speak from your personal experience and your work with those who are suffering from mental illness and who are contemplating suicide, the impact that opening the parameters of MAID can have more broadly on the culture of suicide prevention in Canada?
It opens the door. Just to be clear, I'm talking about conditions that do not have a reasonable foreseeability of death. In the previous session, Dr. Smith spent a lot of time talking about dementia, and I don't understand why it would be going through this mental disorder route. There's a route that when there's reasonable foreseeability of death like dementia has, that you would go through that route. And so I actually don't believe dementia would be excluded if we take out mental disorder. So from a personal experience, though, the darkness that Dr. Masuda talked about is overwhelming. It's painful. It's isolating. It lies to you. It is not the state of mind in which somebody should be making a decision to get married or buy a house or things in life, let alone ending life.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cooper. Next, oh my goodness, who is the next questioner? I don't have my paper in front of me. Is it Mr. Arsenault did it last time? Would it be Dr. Hetty Fry? Apologies, I'm misplaced my notes. Okay, Dr. Fry.
That's all right, Chair. It happens. I really wanted to ask a couple of questions of Dr. Masuda. Dr. Masuda, are you a psychiatrist?
I am not. I'm a palliative care physician.
Yes. So you really have no basis for discussing whether psychiatric disease is irremediable, non-irremediable, curable, not curable, etc., or that the diagnosis can be made on any of those things. We heard from a psychiatrist in the last panel who told us that it is indeed possible to do those things. Have you used psilocybin on all your patients through request made?
No, I have not, because really what I'm looking for.
Please, I only have 5 minutes.
Yes.
Could you just give me a yes or no answer, please?
Okay. Not on all patients, no.
Yes. So psilocybin is just a drug that is under sort of use right now, but there are no conclusions. There have been no clinical studies about psilocybin, really. And so you are suggesting that it's a cure-all.
There are studies using psilocybin in the treatment of.
Is it a cure-all? Do you think it's a cure-all for any irremediable problem for people who are not in imminent danger of death?
I do not think it is a cure-all by any means, but it has.
Thanks very much, Dr. Masuda. I'd like to go to Mr. Crossert. Mr. Crossert, I am so glad to see that you are with us today and that you did not succumb to your bouts of depression and suicidal ideation. But you have talked a little bit about the fact that that you've been helped. Obviously, this is good. All of us believe it's good. But do you believe that, as Dr. Smith said earlier on, and as the courts, under a very long cross-examination, have actually decided, in certain cases, Truchon being one, is that actually the trained psychiatrists, who have the ability to distinguish between suicidal ideation, which could be temporary, and a mental illness that is irreversible. And I noted that the courts also said that the ability to decide whether something is irremediable or not, or intolerable or not, is something that only a patient can make a decision, because they know what they're living in, they know what they believe, they know what their options are. And that if given good options and all of the informed consent, that a patient has the right to decide whether they qualify or not for irremediable suffering, or whether they wish to have the treatment that is being offered to them, because for them the treatment is not something they want to accept. Courts have said ruled positively on those things. Do you agree with those things?
No, I don't.
Okay.
My personal experience tells me that you can be in a state of mind suffering from severe depression that you believe it's going to last the rest of your life. And if somebody asked me, are you ever going to get better? I would say definitively, I will not get better. It's gone on too long.
Thank you, Mr. Crossroad, but you are not the only, you are the person living in your own body. And as we heard from Dr. Smith, the whole human being must be looked at here. That whole person with a brain that is now being afflicted by some sort of different way of looking at the world, or by mental illness. And so this is part of the overall human being that we're talking about. And the courts have ruled that this is very different. You have learned a particular lesson from your own experience. That is not necessary for every human being that is suffering from a mental illness and from a chronic illness in which they decide they do not want any more treatment for it, which is different from suicidal ideation, by the way. So do you really believe that this should be done, as MAID is suggesting, on a case-by-case basis, dealing with physicians who have that ability to understand competency, to understand the difference between suicide and irremediable and intolerable suffering, and can therefore make those decisions to assist a patient who has got all the informed consent available in terms of all their options? Do you agree that this is an individual thing, and that we can't use your experience to define what another human being's experience will be in a given case?
So very briefly, Mr. Crossert.
The answer is no, because...
Thank you very much, Mr. Crossert. I've run out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And next we have Monsieur Thériault.
Merci, Madame la Coprésidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Mr. Crossert. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Thank you. I think that I've read the report dozens of times, and I think I'm going to keep reading it because there are all kinds of questions I keep asking. In Recommendation 8, where they talk about consistency, the thoughtful nature of a demand for or request for MAID, they say that there has to be consistency, it has to be unambiguous, and rationally arrived at during a period of stability and not during a crisis period. And that helped me understand what they were talking about. Because it seems that when you went through your darkest period, you wouldn't have been eligible, even if you'd made the request for MAID. So I'm going to talk to you about a certain case, and you can tell me if you think that this woman should have been eligible. This is a woman of 70 years of age who had a major mental disorder, depressive disorder, and a post-traumatic condition that she'd had from a young age. She'd expressed the wish to die since she was 20. She'd attempted suicide 30 times, some serious enough that she had to be hospitalized. She was not able to work, couldn't have social relationships because of her disorder. She asked for MAID because the symptoms of her condition resisted 35 psychosocial and other interventions of neuromodulation, and that she didn't want to try any more. At the present time, she doesn't intend to commit suicide. In your opinion, if somebody were assessed, this person were assessed rigorously, should this woman have access to MAID? Given your own experience.
You know, I don't think so. And the reason is that the condition seems to, and in this particular case that you gave, it's gone for a long time, and it's not unreasonable to think that it's going to last a long time. But it also, in my mind, you know, you said, you know, she doesn't want to go under further treatment. The question really is, do we want to be party to helping people die prematurely? And I think it's in an absence of absolute evidence, data that shows, you know, objectively that this is not going to ever be able to be treated, so that the suffering can be reduced. I think we have to say no in absence of that objective data, because I'll tell you, subjectively, the condition isolates you, the condition lies to you, and it is simply not the truth for so many people. And while you might be able to find a case here or there that, wow, that really should, there is no other way, you're going to find as many cases of people that end their life prematurely when it could have gotten so much better.
Merci votre effort de réponse. J'apprécie votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer. I appreciate it. It seems to me that in this debate, there are times when the chronic nature of a mental illness turns a corner, that it passes a milestone, and where it becomes, where it makes it the person is in a state of continued palliative care because the person doesn't get better. And someone who's suffering is hard or barely possible to control. So someone might ask for MAID, and it seems to me that people in palliative care might understand that this is something to which we should answer yes. I guess in that I don't agree with you. That's not a question, it's rather a comment.
Thank you, Monsieur Thériault. And next we will have Mr. McGregor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. I'd like to start with my questions to Dr. Masuda. Thank you so much for joining our committee and helping guide us through this topic. I wanted to expand on your opening statement when you were talking about the patients that you have helped treat with psilocybin therapy. And full disclosure to my honorable committee members, I did write a letter of support for that Section 56 exemption because I think new and innovative treatments are necessary. But Dr. Masuda, I know that in a previous exchange with Dr. Fry, she did say it is not a cure-all, but I'm just wondering if you could maybe expand a bit on the potential promise that it holds. And like, are we just on the tip of the iceberg of what this potentially could mean for interventions?
Mm-hmm. So this is a treatment where if there's clinical indication, I do offer it. The clinical indication are people who are stuck in a thought process of hopelessness and demoralization, and they are truly stuck. I had a patient who was in her early 30s who had extremely complex pain we could not manage. She had been through tertiary care units. She had every conceivable pain option offered to her. And we just could not manage her existential distress. She couldn't communicate. She was a ball of a mess, weeping. She couldn't interact with her friends or family, and truly was suffering a deep suffering. And it was she was the second patient in Canada to receive a Section 56 exemption. And with her 24 hours later, after administering this one medication, it broke that trap. The place where often you hear psychiatrists and therapists say, my patient got to a point I couldn't get past it. Well, it broke past that. And within 24 hours, she had no pain. We were ramping down her pain medication. She was alert, oriented. She could actually talk about death and dying. She could reestablish the connections between her friends and family. Since that time, I've had 19 other patients who have had really deep suffering. And we've had no other therapies for this until now. And I think this is a breakthrough. I've seen people in a state where they just can't get through, whether they're drinking too much and they can't stop drinking, whether they cannot interact with their friends and family, whether they're stuck in a terror state because they're dying. And within 24 hours, we see a complete change in that because, there are many studies, there are functional MRI studies. We know how these drugs work, but they've been restricted and they've been unavailable to patients.
And yeah, and on that, because you have experienced the difficulty with going and applying for a Section 56 exemption. There's been a lot of hoops to jump through. In some cases, the wait times have been long and onerous. You have the ability now to speak to a committee which is going to table a report and include recommendations. So from your point of view, from your experiences, what kind of recommendations would you like to see this committee make with respect to access to psilocybin, further research? Just if you can elaborate on that point, please.
Thank you. So the use of psychedelics in the States has now been termed groundbreaking. These are groundbreaking interventions. It's not just about the medicine, it's about giving the medicine in the context of therapy. So this is using psychedelic trained physicians and therapists. But this is groundbreaking. This is a way where patients who are stuck in a certain thought pattern and behavior pattern, we give them a psychedelic, it opens their brain, so now we can establish new patterns of thought and behavior. This is groundbreaking type of intervention, and this is where I think we need to move forward, allowing patients with substance use disorder, chronic depression and anxiety, where we think there is no treatment. I believe that there is a treatment, and we should look at allowing this to be accessible to all Canadians.
And just quickly, my final question. In the previous panel, Dr. Smith, when he was talking about the concept of irremediability, He said that it's a state when no more treatments are available that are acceptable to both the healthcare provider and to the patient. When your experience, when a patient decides that there are no other options for them that are acceptable, how do you try to move past that? Like when your treatment options might be blocked by the patient's sense?
It is a very tricky question, because certainly if I have a patient who has cancer and they say, treatment with chemotherapy doesn't align with my core values, I have to respect that patient and say, even though, you're on a dying trajectory, choosing not to use a medical intervention which can prevent dying is actually is your right to make that decision. Mental health is really difficult because
thank you. Yes, we're over 5 minutes already, but I wanted to just acknowledge that Dr. Kwame McKenzie has joined, but his sound hasn't been tested. And given it's already 4:15 almost, I'm wondering whether should we allow Dr. McKenzie to speak for a few minutes since he's joined us. Okay, I see nodding heads. Okay, Dr. McKenzie, hopefully your sound will work for us, and just a few minutes for your testimony. Thank you.
Chair, just one thing I wanted to say, that I also signed the letter for psilocybin to be a Section 56 exemption. So I'm just putting that on.
Thank you. All right, so Dr. McKenzie, go ahead. So if you can condense your remarks because of time, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear, and I apologize for this has been my most embarrassing Zoom call so far this year, and apologies for that, but we've managed to get on. And thanks very much for allowing me to speak today. I'm honored to be here. As you know, I was the chair of the 2018 report by the CCA on MAID and mental disorders as a single underlying medical condition. I was also a member of the Halifax group, which published a paper on MAID safeguards. And both the CCA report and the Halifax group report wrestle with the same issues as Health Canada's 2020 expert panel on MAID and mental illness. And those main issues are the ones that I've heard you talking about already, which are eligibility, capacity, suicidality, the intersection between MAID and the social determinants of health or structural vulnerability, and safeguards. And I know you have read the reports, and I'm happy to discuss those, but I thought I'd use just a minute or two to draw attention to three things. The possible impacts of COVID-19, social determinants of health, and racial inequity on MAID for mental illness. Now, just to explain, the assessment of suffering in mental health problems is partly linked to the adequacy of treatment, but also because of the social impact of the illness. And social exclusion and the feeling that you're difficult, you have a difficult future ahead of you, increase the perception of suffering. The suffering of people with mental health problems is likely to increase because of COVID-19. We had a crisis of increased rates of illness, increased rates of mental health problems, and inadequate access to care and supports before COVID. And things have got worse because of COVID itself, because of the increased need for services, but also because of staff burnout and decreased capacity of services. And so we've got a greater imbalance between service provision and need. And if the number of people not able to access appropriate treatment increases, we have increased numbers of suffering. And therefore, if we have increase of numbers of people suffering, we have increase. We've got to consider what that means for MAID and mental illness. But COVID-19 isn't the only stressor. Of course, we've got the affordability crisis and curves on government spending, which again will impact suffering of people with mental health problems because they're making realistic comparative appraisals of where they are in their lives compared to others. And as the social safety net comes under pressure and affordability becomes more of an issue, perceived suffering may increase. And then there's racial inequality. And we all know that COVID-19 has hit Indigenous, Black, and other racialized groups hard, that these groups were previously underserved by mental health services, and those disparities are likely to increase. They're also less likely to get the social supports they need. And so again, we've got a differential increase in suffering. So far, none of the reports that have been tabled that I talked about have properly discussed the differential impacts of MAID on different racial groups. And I note that the Health Canada report doesn't suggest that there needs to be consultation with Indigenous populations in the implementation of the safeguards. But did not recommend that Black and other racialized groups should be specifically also consulted. And I think that's an error. And so what I'm suggesting we need to be thinking about is that there needs to be an increased focus on how to ensure that every person who's considering MAID, where mental disorders are the single underlying medical condition, would have full access to appropriate and effective medical support. At the moment, we say they need to know about it, but the question is, do we assure that they actually have full access? And of course, it's clear that we need to build a system which doesn't only offer the medical support, but also make sure that people with mental health problems are not socially excluded, living in poverty, and believing that they have no future. But for MAID, we actually have to ensure that people accessing MAID have had proper access to social supports. And lastly, we need to ensure that this group and our expert panels and other groups who are thinking about MAID law have full and considered engagement with Black and other racialized groups so that their needs are properly reflected in the transformational laws that we're talking about. And so all in all, my concern is that our safeguards should focus on ensuring that people have had proper equitable access to all of the treatment and social support that they need to decrease their suffering. And so to ensure that we're not creating an off-ramp for social suffering through MAID. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKenzie. And I'll turn this back to MP Garneau.
Thank you, Senator Martin. We'll now go to the senator round of questions. And once again, the first three senators will have 4 minutes each. Nous allons commencer avec la sénatrice Mégy.
And we'll begin with Senator Mégy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Professor McKenzie. With all the post-COVID suffering that you have talked about, do you have data or have you noticed whether there are requests for MAID coming from disadvantaged persons, talking about Indigenous, Black, socioeconomically disadvantaged? Is there an increased demand for MAID from these persons?
Okay, so I'm a psychiatrist, and obviously still until 2023 we have MAID is essentially not available to people with mental health problems, and so I haven't been able to observe that myself.
Okay. Okay. Merci. Puis j'ai une question pour...
Thank you. And I also have a question for Dr. Masuda. You said earlier in your statement that MAID was for people who are going to die, but you know that this reason or condition was invalidated in the Truchel ruling. And it could, because this could be running counter to the human rights of people who have mental health disorders. If they were excluded from this possibility, that would be a human rights violation. What do you think?
I suppose we look at patients or Canadians and say you have the right to make decisions about how you live, how you die. I have, not an issue with people accessing medical assistance in dying based on their own personal values, core values. What I do have an issue with is offering medical assistance in dying for people who are really depressed and stuck and feel that their case is irremediable because of the social determinants of health have not been met. If you are impoverished, if you are isolated, then you feel that there is no end to your suffering. And so we need to ensure that all these people have access to food, to housing, and to any treatments that could change the course of their illness.
Et est-ce que j'ai juste quelques secondes?
Do I have a few seconds left? Yes, you have a minute. I have a question. I think I'll put it to Mr. Krausert and to Dr. Masuda. Just some brief answers, please. You said you needed robust measures, and you talked about a multidisciplinary assessment. I find that interesting, but are there any other measures which you have come up with following your reflection on this issue and your discussions with your peers about?
Dr. Masuda.
Yes, I have a number of cases where I feel that either family or even healthcare providers have been coercing a patient to contemplate MAID for a number of different reasons. This is also where I feel there has to be safeguards. I've seen patients, hey, this is really, I'm seeing you suffering a lot here. Have you considered MAID? This is not uncommon for a patient to experience. A physician or a family member or somebody coming up and offering MAID as a really good solution to their problem. And this is where I think we really need multidisciplinary safeguards.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. McKenzie, did you want to comment very quickly?
Yes, I do think that the Health Canada recommendations of a multidisciplinary team taking assessments over time and getting collateral information is probably the best that we can do with our science at the moment, is taking a considered case-by-case approach to this situation is what is done in various other parts of the world. And I think that that's the best we can do at the moment.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Senator Kutcher. Senator Kutcher, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. My first question is to Mr. Krausert. You talked about MAID opening the door to suicide and that the presence of MAID impacts by legitimizing suicide. So a question for you. Have the rates of suicide in Canada changed significantly compared to before MAID and after MAID was instituted? So if this was the case, we'd expect to see significant increases in suicide rates. Have there been significant increases in suicide rates in Canada after MAID?
Well, the access to MAID for mental disorder alone has not. No,
I'm not asking. You were not talking about mental disorder. About suicide in general because of MAID. So I'm asking you a question.
No, I didn't say that. I said that CASP supports the rights of individuals who are capable of making decisions for suicide or for accessing MAID when death is foreseeable and we don't take into those accounts. I do know that in other jurisdictions where this is entered in, suicide rates did not drop, which means that there were additional deaths because of
all right.
MAID.
So that's pretty clear. Suicide rates didn't go down, in your knowledge, when MAID was being discussed in the public domain. So my question now is to our other witness on psilocybin. We know that psilocybin, there's an emerging database for its use in palliative care, and that's good. What proportion of people seeking MAID for mental illness are currently cured or effectively treated by psilocybin?
For mental illness or patients, my dealing is with patients with significant moral distress related to cancer, so that's palliative.
That's what I heard you say, but we're talking about MAID here. So I'm asking you the question, what proportion of people seeking MAID, I don't want the panel to be misguided, what proportion of people seeking MAID for mental illness are cured or effectively treated by psilocybin?
I can say that currently we don't have access to psilocybin, so we cannot make any claims until we have good clinical trials. There is clinical data available in the United States.
Yeah, so what does that say?
So for people with chronic mental illness, and so we're looking at chronic depression and anxiety disorder.
But we're talking about for MAID, not just chronic anxiety disorder, because that's not the MAID universe. People who are seeking MAID
chronic mental illness.
That's not the universe for MAID. So we're talking about MAID. So let's focus on MAID. For the people seeking MAID, so that's the question. What is the evidence that psilocybin is effective in treating them?
Well, we don't know that information because
we don't
have patients seeking MAID for chronic mental illness yet.
All right, so that's fine. So we don't have that information. So what you're talking to us about is very speculative, and you're extrapolating from use in palliative care and demoralization to people whose sole underlying condition is a mental disorder.
No, because there is clinical evidence in the States using MDMA and psilocybin that these are effective treatments for chronic mental illness.
No, but for people seeking MAID.
Well, we don't know that because people can't seek MAID for chronic mental illness yet.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so the fact that we don't have evidence and you're extrapolating from other data is important. Dr. McKenzie, you make really, really good points, and obviously we social determinants of health are essential to establish. Do you think that people seeking MAID who are in precarious living situation or racialized or minorities or anybody like that should be offered those interventions as part of the assessment of MAID?
Yes, I would think that we should do as much as we can to try and alleviate people's suffering. I'm probably different from the other panelists because I'm a psychiatrist who's seen a lot of suffering over the last 30 years. And I don't want people to suffer needlessly. And so I would balance people's right to make their own decisions with what can be reasonably offered by the state. I'd like as much offered as possible, but in a democracy, everybody can't have everything. We know that, and so I think there's a balance. And I'm always really happy to see people being very, very positive about the possibilities of miracle treatments in psychiatry. But I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've seen miracle treatments come and go, and I've still seen a lot of suffering in mental health. And I focus on the social determinants of health because some of them can be ameliorated.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Senator. And we'll now go to Senator Wallin.
Thank you, Chair. A quick point to Dr. Masuda, if I could. You made the statement, and we've heard this from other witnesses from time to time, that MAID is being offered up as a solution to psychological, psychiatric, or social problems, et cetera. Do you have any evidence or the name of a doctor or a MAID provider who has offered up MAID without process to somebody who, is just feeling down or doesn't have a place to live? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Dr. Masuda? We see you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Okay, well, if Chair, if I could get you again, this is kind of a recurring theme, but when statements such as that are made, it would be very helpful for the committee here to have actual evidence, because I think, as I've stated before, if people are not going through the correct MAID process, then they have clearly broken a law. So we should be informed about that. I would go to Dr. McKenzie if I could. And we've heard some testimony here, but also the statistics show that those who choose MAID are generally white, wealthy, and willing. So is it your position that others, maybe minority groups or people who are facing severe social issues, aren't being given the opportunity or aren't being presented with this as a possibility or a choice they might want to make at some point?
No, that wouldn't be, and thank you for the question.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, but my position would be that most of the information and data we have on MAID at the moment ends up being, well, it's obviously historical, but we haven't hit steady state on the numbers of people who are eventually going to be getting MAID in Canada. And we also have changes in the law coming through, as well as changes in guidelines and safeguards. And so we don't know exactly where we're going to end up. My worry is just to make sure we don't, and I'm worried to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we haven't done enough and MAID is considered an off-ramp for social suffering. I don't think we're there yet, but I don't want us to get there. And so it was being mindful rather than saying there is data at the moment showing that we have high numbers of Indigenous or racialized or low-income people who are applying for MAID at the moment. But
so the statistics say, in fact, the opposite. So what kind of a safeguard would you propose then? Is there something that you think would prevent that slippery slope?
Well, I'm not sure that it's a slippery slope, but I do think that I wanted to make sure that we're mindful when we're thinking, as we tend to say, we want to make sure that everybody's had an opportunity for all of the medical treatment that they require. And I was flagging that it would be good to also make sure that people have a proper social assessment and they get access to all of the social supports that are required. So I'm not making any grand statements that I know that there are huge differences. I just know that there are huge differences in mental health needs coming through because of what we're going through at the moment. And I wouldn't want us not to be blindsided by that. So it really is for consideration than and trying to look forward than saying that there are issues right now.
All right, so that's you're tying that more specifically to the COVID situation.
Well, there's a COVID situation, but in places like the UK, they've had the biggest drop in standard of living since 1950 because of the economic climate and the possibility of a bigger, wider war. And so I think it's not just COVID. We've got climate change and we've got significant economic problems that headwinds that we seem to have to be thinking about, and that we know will change the rates of suffering and the perception of suffering. And that was really the flag that I was trying to raise here rather than anything else. And I was trying to be balanced, and I think if I'd had a bit more time, it would have probably come across a bit more humble in my assessment.
No, I think it was just important to clarify. So thank you for that.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Co-Président.
Oui, point d'ordre.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Yes, Mr. Arsenault, I didn't want to interrupt Senator Wallin, but she asked a very important question to Dr. Masuda, and she didn't answer. Could she commit to answering us in writing? Just what I was going to say.
Sure. Dr. Masuda, you were not able to answer for technical reasons the question from Senator Wallen, but we would appreciate a written answer to the question that she posed to you. Can you give us a thumbs up that you'll follow through on that? Thank you very much. And we'll now go to Senator Martin for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Krausert, can you explain what CASP's position is on capacity for MAID for mental illness or disorder? And could you explain to us what full disclosure for informed consent for MAID for mental illness would have to look like?
Yes. Well, capacity, I think, has to be assessed by the doctor, and obviously taking into account the condition from which the person is suffering, because when we're talking about mental disorders, there is some influence on capacity. That being my experience. As far as full disclosure, I think we have to disclose that with a particular condition that, for example, there's anywhere between 0 and 100% chance of remediability, and because we don't have the data, and so there has to be. I don't know how it could be concluded subjectively without the objective data supporting it. So, that sort of disclosure, I think, needs to be done. And as the report talks about some sort of subjective shared understanding on such things between the practitioner and the patient. It's so subjective. We bend over backwards in our criminal code to protect innocent from being proven guilty, even if it means some guilty people get let go. I'm suggesting the safeguards have to be in place to ensure that those who would regret it, and all of those impacted by it. Don't forget, there's a ripple effect of between friends, coworkers, contacts that every one of these deaths has. We're talking about a major impact. It's not a decision just for the person, it's a decision for the community. And we have to make sure that we really have those safeguards in place.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing your personal experience and story. It was really give us a sense of the sort of the insights we need to have. And I think your voice today was very important. Thank you, Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Mr. Cooper, you have a point of order.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. I know that we are scheduled to go in camera to consider 2 motions, but I would submit, just in the interest of time, of not having to log in again, that there would be some merit in not going in camera, and at least speaking to my specific motion. I think it would be appropriate that the motion be considered out of camera in public, a motion to requesting that this committee dedicate 6 hours to the study of the effectiveness, compliance, and enforceability of existing safeguards under the C-14 and C-7 regimes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cooper. We have previously made the decision that we're going to go into camera, so in camera for this discussion and for other business as well.
Well, so, Mr. Chair, I would just put forward a motion that we consider my motion outside in public, not in camera.
Very good. So let's put that to a vote. I would like to see a show of hands for committee members who would like to go.
Well, I'd request, Mr. Chair, I'd request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote, yes, that's fine. So those who are in favor of supporting the motion from Mr. Cooper, please raise your hand.
I had a request a recorded vote, a roll call.
Very good. Mr. Clerk, go ahead and call the names.
Mr. Chair, I should inform you that it is out of order to propose a motion on a point of order.
A good reminder. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. I'm afraid your point of order is out of order, Mr. Cooper. I want to finish off by thanking our witnesses today. We very much appreciate it. This is on behalf of the committee. So thank you very much, Mr. Sean Krausert. Thank you, Dr. Masuda, and thank you, Dr. McKenzie. We're really glad that we got you, even though there were some technical difficulties. We very much appreciate your input to this important work of our committee. With that, I will suspend. There will be a little time before we are able to come back in camera. And so all of the members should now go to the new link for the in-camera session. And Mr. Clerk, as soon as we have that quorum, we will be in a position to start our third hour. Thank you.